Any questions, please add them to the chat, and Tracy and I will gather them for the end of Chris and Tony's keynote, and we can start to ask those questions then. Thank you.
Okay, well, welcome. My name is Tony Bertram. This is my colleague Chris Pascal, and welcome to this Saturday morning. Well, it's not morning, is it now? It's lunchtime here in the UK. I think there are some people who are joining us from overseas. And to say it's Saturday morning here, one of the few mornings recently at the weekend when it's not been raining. And what are you doing here? You know, I have to say, I can commend your professionalism, and particularly those of you who are practitioners who already had a hard week's work. And if I ask myself why you're here, I guess the answer is it's because you care and you want to get better at what you do, and for working with children and families. And as I say, I commend your professionalism that you're prepared to give up your Saturdays to do that. I just hope that we have something worthwhile and useful for you to share with you. So this is a piece of work that we competed for, and we were lucky to be involved with, that was put out by the Froebel Trust. Chris and I, neither of us are Froebelian trained, although those of you who know Tina Bruce's work will understand that that tradition of European early childhood philosophers, you know, running from Malaguzzi to Montessori and Froebel and Steiner and so on. She looked at those traditions, and in that sense, I think this is more than Froebel, although it's been funded by the Froebel Trust. Those principles that we believe in terms of early childhood practice are something that we can all assign to. So, yeah, CREC, Centre for Research in Early Childhood. We do research and development, and I see it says 25 years there. I think it's probably a little longer than that, more like 35. And we're self-funding. We are connected with universities across the West Midlands, but we're not, we're independent. And we live on the work of our team, really, and raising funds from grants and also from this professional development that we do. And we have a master's degrees. I'm not sure if Helen may have not told you about this already. Music MAs, we have master's modules that you can do in service, and we do also PhDs. So we do advanced level degrees. We have a SCIT, you know, a school centered in service training, initial teacher training, and we currently have 15 PhDs. And I think one of the things I'd like to say about CREC is that we try and focus, and certainly our PhDs of this, we try and focus on developing scholarship and a critical mass of thinkers, a group of thinkers, creating a forum for that links research and practice and policy. And this piece of work we're going to talk to you about fits into that view. And I mention that because when Chris did her PhD, she was actually a nursery teacher in Birmingham, and somebody said to her, "What on earth do you want to do a PhD for if you're a nursery teacher?" And I think some of that kind of attitude and those views still hold true today. Of course, it's about developing good practice, good pedagogy, but it's actually also about, I think Kurt Lewin said, that there's nothing so practical as having a good theory. And I think certainly Chris was the first professor of early childhood studies in the UK. Before that, we had professors of developmental psychology, or there might be somebody in health who had a particular interest in early childhood, or there might be somebody in social services who wanted to focus on young children and families. All of those are fine. But actually what CREC wants to do is to focus on early childhood studies and to make that a proper discipline with scholarship to look at. And I link this to some of the thinking that we've had before. And forgive me, those of you who've heard this before. We talk, no, at least the Greeks talked about a taxonomy of thinking, a taxonomy of knowledge. They had things like words like nous to describe common sense, and techno and art as another form of thinking. But the two particular ones that I'm interested in, or we're interested in, are Sophia, which is the knowledge that comes from books and study, and from gurus like that Chris Pascal, that Sophia, and Doctor of Philosophy, Philo, and Sophia, philosophy. I love knowledge, a love of knowledge. There's the whole thing around Sophia, a knowledge that's created in that kind of scholarly way. But there's a whole other part of knowledge that the Greeks identified, and that's called phronesis. Phronesis is P-H-R-E-N-S-I-S. Look it up. Phronesis is really the knowledge that comes from wisdom, and wisdom comes from experience. Now, you can have experience in terms of, I've done 20 years of doing this, but if it's the same year that you've repeated 20 times, that isn't wisdom. That's just repetitive dullness. So phronesis is about reflecting on the wisdom that comes from experience. And it's those two things, the Sophia, the research and the knowledge from practice, that we felt years ago was missing. And that what we wanted to do was to create a forum and a critical mass of scholarship around those things. So research, practice, and policy. So that's CREC, and that's what we're about. I guess that I'd want to just say a little bit more about what we're calling praxeology, which is something that many people know that we've talked about in the past. The idea that praxis and ology, you remember Maureen Lipman used to have that thing for BT, didn't she? The advert, oh, you got an ology. That's an ology is just a body of knowledge. So praxeology is a body of knowledge about praxis. And praxis is what Frere identified. It's understanding what practice is about, but in both a practical and a research scholarly way. Systematic and rigorous research around that. That's what we're interested in. So we're fitting that into this context. We're fitting this new piece of work into that context. That's where we're coming from. Our positionality as a centre, if you like. So we've already done some work, and you can look up this reference, Chris et al. I mean Pascal et al. I'm known as I'm known in the trade as Al. I'm the Pascal in it and Al. You can call me Al. So this COVID pandemic, significant life challenges for all children. And one of the things that's emerging is that where there are inequalities and disadvantage, actually COVID seems to deepen that and make it even more difficult. It's always those who are most in need who get hit the hardest. So, of course, we can talk about the impact of this additional stress, the social isolation, health issues, and the disruption that it causes to family life. And many of the people who work on the front line are, not all of them, but many of them are actually quite low paid, including, I would say, in my opinion, those who work with nursery age children. And then, this whole business of masks and remote contact and restrictive social bubbles and so on. I've got 8 grandchildren. I haven't hugged them since March. That's hard to cope with. And we're hearing these awful stories about care homes and a real suffering amongst the elderly and others. And that impacts on young children and families too. And I think the other thing that we would say is that we do see young children, and some of this comes from Peter Moss, about, you know, early childhood settings. If you view them as social anchors, they're places where people from different communities come, and they may not have a lot in common with each other at a cultural level, but what they do have in common with each other is child raising, if you like, in which you can see early childhood settings as being the first civic forums, the first opportunity that many people have to mix with people from other groups, and particularly around the issue of children. So that young children have had their lives disrupted, but I do think that there's a sense in which early childhood settings are special in terms of this function of being social magnets for communities, places where things happen that bring all the communities together. So we're interested in children's rights, and in fact, many of our certainly one or two of our PhD students have been specifically looking at rights, and do see children as citizens in their own right, and should that they have a right to speak. They should be given voice, a right to play too, and to be listened to, and maybe also that it's not just the listening, is it? That they need to see, as we all do in a democracy, that it's okay for our voice to be listened to, but what are the subsequent actions that come from that? So to be the right to speak and the right to be listened to, but also to the right to see that you have some impact on things. We also believe that children are fully capable of reflecting on these experiences. They are sentient beings, and they also are very good at expressing the felt impact. It's others who don't take the trouble to find ways in which we can listen to what it is that they're expressing, because they are certainly expressing, as we will see, their reflections on their experiences. So listening to and acting upon the perspectives of these young citizens, and I hope I've made the case that they are citizens, during this these extraordinary times, that seems to be in keeping with where we are, and it's about inclusive, civic, democratic societies that have a sense of solidarity, and giving everyone the right to have a voice. So part of this work was about capturing and promoting children's narratives, and those who know our published work will know that that's also been a focus of our research over a number of years, and you can Google that and look it up. So Froebel piece of work, it was competitive, and we were fortunate to get to it. As I said, Chris and I aren't Froebelians, but we are happy with the concepts that Froebel put forward, mostly. And in this project, we were particularly interested to capture children's expressed narratives about their experiences. I do think that we are getting better in early childhood research at capturing children's voices, that we're learning better techniques. Perhaps some of the stories and narratives that Chris is going to share with you will be useful for you in terms of doing your own bit of work on children's narratives. And we used, Froebel talked about storytelling and how powerful that was in terms of when you're developing a Froebelian pedagogy, to create opportunities for children to express issues around their social and emotional health, and also to contain their fears and anxieties. That whole thing that Maurice Sendak, you know, where the wild things are, sort of addressing, you know, we create a story around I think in that case, where the wild things are, it was about nightmares and dreams, you know, and where we put these, and creating that opportunity for the people, for children to talk through those experiences and come to terms with them, and sometimes to make them explicit. So that was part of the power of the storytelling, and to promote in children this idea of them as active, feeling and thinking human beings, and encouraging to make connections with their own lives. That's all part of mental health, as well as friendship bonds, and just being normal and enjoying childhood. So all of that we felt was important, and ensuring that children were valued and listened to, and that was part of their nurturing. So that was the context. And we come to this, how did we do it? Well, this was praxeological, as I've said before, the study of praxis, and it was going to be action research. So although it's ongoing, the intention is that what we learn is going to make a difference in terms of developing an action research cycle. So this, we're hoping, is having an impact. And we're doing it in 4 different Froebelian nursery settings, and those nursery settings are in diverse communities, less advantaged communities, and they're in 3 different countries. So that gives us quite a lot of variables there to play with in terms of getting a range of different experience. And of course, the impact was unique, and uniquely so in each of the 4 settings. So we had New Zealand, a Froebelian nursery in New Zealand. One of the interesting things about that is that New Zealand is now coming out of that. I mean, of course, it's coming into summer there. Their sport is watched by hordes of people, you know, in large stadia now, and they're all sitting there and shouting and enjoying themselves. There's a sense in which New Zealand has got through the COVID pandemic at the moment, and so that's quite interesting. What's happening to those children who've been through the process and now are coming out at the end of it? You know, it might. We're hoping that it might be our tale for the future. So there's New Zealand is involved, and we have 2 sites in Scotland. And again, Scotland certainly is different from England in terms of its approach to COVID. They've had some of our issues, but again, you feel that it's being handled differently, and certainly in terms of the professional development of educators in Scotland, I think there's been far more investment in Scotland in early years practitioners, and they also, I think, the Scots generally have a different view of what education is, and a more positive view of the importance of education, in my view, in Scotland. That's part of the culture. They use this phrase, forgive the genderedness, a man of parts, as someone who has been able to find social mobility through education. So New Zealand, going through Scotland, and England, a site in Guildford, and again, we can make similarities and differences between all the sites. So we're gathering detailed narrative sequences from the children themselves in their play, and these children are aged 2 to 4 years. There's 58 of them altogether within the whole study, and 22 early years practitioners. So that sets the scene. It tells you something about the positionality of CREC, and Chris now is going to take you through what did we do, emerging narratives.
Okay, thank you, Tony, for setting the scene so clearly. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the process and some of the early findings that have come out of it. But before I get into that, I want to just say a little bit more about the storytelling approach that we're trying to document. There is two strands to this project. One, as Tony's articulated, the one we're sharing with you today is the narratives of the children about their COVID experiences and how their approach to that themselves, how their experiences are telling us about what their needs are and how we might support them through this process a little bit more. So the children are the real focus of the project. But alongside that, the Froebel Trust were also interested in how the pedagogy in these nurseries was supporting the children's emotional well-being and development during this time. And storytelling is a pedagogic approach which just Froebelian. It crosses all early childhood philosophies, this importance of listening well to children's narratives and through their play. And interestingly, and seeing music and dance as vital strategies for expression of emotion and feelings about something. So Froebel principles and pedagogy particularly foreground the use of storytelling as being this vital strategy, and how it's articulated in Froebelian philosophy is helping the child's inner world to be expressed to the outer world. And that's what we're trying to do with this. How are children processing this internal intuitive response to what these experiences have been, and how can we enable them to express them and use them to enable us to understand them better. But also in the expression of that inner world, there's a kind of therapy there. So it also, we hope, supports the children's social and emotional and mental in the way they do that, and particularly observing how children tell their narratives and their stories through their play, through music and dance, and through other mechanisms, through conversations. So the practitioners, the 22 practitioners in our study have been working to offer many opportunities or affordances for the children to express these inner worlds. So creating different play spaces, different resources, photo picture prompts. I haven't got time to talk today about the pedagogy, but we will be writing that up and talking to it, but being very innovative about how they're weaving opportunities through music, puppets, craft, conversations, play, resources, to give children lots of opportunities or affordances to express what their experiences have been. And these narratives are not just kind of one-off events. What we're doing is observing children over a period of time to see the threads in their narratives and the connectedness. Another thing in Froebel is the unity or the connectedness of children's life and experiences. So we're trying to document the narratives as they happen, and they're taking many forms. And then we're linking them together in narrative sequences, we're calling them, and then looking across the narratives to look at the themes. And those narratives, as it says here, they take many forms. So what we've done in terms of the methodology for the project, each of the 22 practitioners have been trained. We had a really lovely session led by Lynn McNair and Sally Cave, really deepening the practitioners' understanding of storytelling within a Froebelian pedagogy. And if you're interested in that, Lynn McNair, Tina Bruce, and a colleague from Scotland, her name escapes me at the moment, but you can find it out. They've developed, they've just published a new book on storytelling, which is a fantastic book to look at as a resource. But they worked with the practitioners, deepening their understanding of storytelling as a pedagogic strategy. And then Tony and I trained everybody in action research and how to document children's narratives and then how to analyse them. Each of the 4 study sites is supported by a pedagogic lead from the locality and also a research lead from CREC. We've got these 58 children involved. We hope that represent quite that diversity in the cohort, and they're documenting the expressed narratives of children. It started in August when the children started to come back. And we're documenting them up to Christmas and looking at how children's narratives develop over that period of time. And then we're using those sequences to create a multimedia narrative sequence for each child. Alongside that, the practitioners are keeping a journal and a log to document how they worked with those children. So we've got two narratives, and practitioner narratives and child narratives coming out of the study. And then those narratives are being collated together and to provide what I'm calling a mosaic of experience, which is deepened by regular reflective dialogues between the site practitioners. We meet up on Zoom regularly and talk about the interpretation of what these narratives are and looking for key themes and saliences. And it's those that we're going to share with you in this second part of this presentation. But we particularly want them to feed as soon as we can into practice, and we're ambitious that we will help impact on policy too, because we think the youngest children have been excluded from feeding into policy responses at the moment. So to be aware that the project is still live, we're still in the process of collecting the children's narratives. So, you know, these are early insights, but we feel already that we are beginning to get an insight into what the children are saying. And these child narratives suggest that storytelling as a pedagogic strategy is helping the children's mental health and social and emotional well-being, and helping them relate their inner world and express them. And they are expressing them through their play and through their conversations and activities. So you know, we've got some lovely stuff coming about pedagogic strategies, which we will be sharing with you at some form. But the children's narratives, which is what I'm going to go on to now, are also, if we look across them, really giving us the message that we shouldn't be feeling that children need to be protected in a kind of, you know, little protective layer of a bubble of life around them. That children in our study are displaying a lot of knowledge and understanding, a lot of wisdom, a lot of sanity about how they're dealing with what's going on. And through that, we can see that mostly, and I'm going to use the word mostly a lot because we have to be aware that some children are really struggling with this, but mostly what we're seeing is a group of young children who have agency. They are fairly resilient. They're finding ways through this pandemic and a way of understanding them. But there are core things that are helping them do that. And as I say, there's some indications for practice already that we can share with you this afternoon, to say this is what children are saying they need to thrive and get through this time. So, you know, several themes emerging, and this afternoon Tony and I want to share just 5 of the themes and transitions, and we're connecting these early insights into with some Froebelian principles here, but you know, we think they go across early childhood practice. So the first theme we're calling transitions and reconnections, and it links to the Froebel principle of unity, connectedness and community. And one of the things that's coming out of our early analysis and interpretation of the children's narratives is that we can see since August and through to the period now, and in the 3 different countries, as Tony said, New Zealand's at a very different stage of progress through this pandemic, that children have experienced and are experiencing serial transitions. They go from lockdown to back to, you know, some limited access to nursery to fully back at nursery. Some of them are experiencing multiple care situations because the nursery is not fully open, so they might have to access an extended family childcare or a childminder or a couple of provisions. So that they're moving into serial transitions and having to reconnect again. But as we're coming through the autumn and the children have come back to nursery largely in all countries, and in New Zealand things are fairly back to normal now, we can see that mostly, the vast majority of those children have managed these transitions pretty well. And we're looking at how they've managed them, and some of that we'll go on to say, but they are managing them quite well. But what we're seeing is they're really showing a deep delight and need to be back at nursery with their friends and with their normal daily routines re-established again. They're expressing through their play the deep importance of connectedness, their community, and being part of that. And I'm going to illustrate this and illustrate each of our 5 themes that we're going to share with you in the last bit of our story through the children's, some snippets or vignettes from the children's story. And I want to illustrate the transitions and reconnection theme and the resilience theme through a story, a story that was shared with us by a practitioner, Oliver's story, which we're calling The Gathering Song. And this was retold by one of our Scottish colleagues. And she says, one day in the living room at the nursery, I heard a guitar. And when I looked around, I saw Oliver by himself playing a small guitar and singing. Music is figuring quite largely in a lot of the children's narratives. So here's Oliver by himself in a high place. I think it was a nursery of different levels. He positioned himself high up, playing this small guitar and singing. And it was the Gathering Song, naming everyone in the room, all the other children, one at a time, with a lovely smile. And he was mirroring or copying Emma, who was the practitioner who during lockdown, she had hosted Zoom gatherings every day for the children in that nursery. And at the beginning of the Zoom gathering, she sang the Gathering Song, where she'd named all the children and sang that song to welcome everybody. Now, Oliver was mirroring or imitating or copying Emma, but he was doing it with his own agency and in his own way, and sitting up there and with great pleasure naming the children their names and connecting. And the practitioners felt that this story revealed the importance of the children of maintaining those routines and habits. They really like that routine, they really like that connectivity, and feeling that they too can be active in connecting that. And I think Oliver's story illustrates that beautifully. The second story I want to share with you, and the second theme that's coming out, links to the Froebel principle of the children's self reflection and making sense and self-activity, taking responsibility themselves. And this theme we've called Children's Silences and Expressions of Resilience. Interestingly, we've seen in New Zealand now, as they've moved out of lockdown, but also it was there all the way through in some of the settings. Some children didn't really want to express anything about COVID. They wanted to just get on with their lives. They wanted to get involved in other, what they saw as more normal narratives, their preoccupations with role play and small world play and superheroes and these kinds of things. And for some of the children, COVID didn't figure largely. It was there in their lives, but they were choosing to put it somewhere. And I'm calling that children's silences. And we've had a big discussion about that should be okay. Children, if that's how children want to deal with it, through processing it themselves and getting back to their normal life, that's part of children's resilience in how they deal with that. And so honouring that and giving them that respect to speak when they want to speak and be silent when they want to be silent about things. But actually, most children were and are exploring their COVID experiences and making sense of them through their play and through their activities. And through that, what we see is children are showing quite a mature understanding of the reasons for the disruptions, why their lives and their routines have to be significantly changed, and why these new COVID safe measures and routines have to be there. And they're almost stoic in the way they're dealing with the loss of their previous lives and making the most of what is currently the new normal of that. So the resilience of these children, their ability to deal with it and manage it and make it work for them, is very evident in their narratives. And we're going to illustrate this through Kaylee's story, which I've called Missed Graduation and Virtual Hugs. So here's Kaylee's story. The practitioners in one nursery had noted that as the children had experienced several bouts of lockdown and then reconnection, you know, it was serially, they couldn't come to nursery than they did. They noticed that the children kind of got better and better at coping with the changes and the shifts in what was going on. So resilience was built over time. They had to reconnect and deal with those transitions. And Kaylee's story shows this resilience building. Now, she'd returned to the nursery a second time after missing out what they called her nursery graduation ceremony. In this nursery, when they moved to primary schooling, they have a kind of graduation ceremony and celebration when they go and visit after which they go and visit their new school. And she'd also missed her birthday party. But when the reasons for why she couldn't go to her graduation and why the birthday party had to be cancelled, she was quite kind of matter of fact and, as I say, stoic about it. Her first response that the practitioner recorded was, well, at least we can pick the flowers. So she was kind of, you know, well, at least there's other things I can do. You know, I can get on with that. There's other joys in life. And maybe that's a lesson for us as adults. Look at what you can do, not at what you can't do. And then whenever someone would say to her it was sad that the birthday party was cancelled or she couldn't go to her graduation, she'd be really clear and she'd say, no, it wasn't cancelled, it was just postponed. So she had this view of she can wait a bit, it'll happen eventually, and I can hang on for that. And another adaptation that Kaylee had initiated herself, and again, this is a lovely illustration of how they're finding ways around things. Kaylee's a child that really loves physical contact, hugging and kissing her friends and people at nursery, and she knows she can't do that at the moment. And the family and the nursery explained to her very clearly that she had to keep a distance from anyone who wasn't in her bubble. So Kaylee made up a new way of handling that. So what happens now is that she now hugs herself like this and asks the other person to do the same thing. So it's a kind of distance self-hug, but we do it together, so that's the connectedness. And she does kisses by opening and shutting her hands, so a hug and kisses. And this is a way that she's found to connect and communicate her affection with the people that she cares about. And it's a lovely way of how she took the initiative to do that herself. Third theme, third strategy, and this is something that I think is where children they really do teach us, don't they? How do we find a way around this? What's important, and what's coming out of the stories in all three countries? Practitioners have noted the increased importance of outdoors, and again, very Froebelian, engaging with nature. And they're saying to us, these nurseries use outdoors a lot, and often children have had choice of being indoors or outdoor. Out of doors, and they're saying prior to COVID, probably 70% of the time, if children had the time to choose, they would be outdoors 70%. But they're saying now over 90% of the time, children are preferring to be out of time when they're in nursery. It's almost that the outdoor is drawing them out, and many of these children have been in lockdown in environments where they've had very little outdoor time. They've been in flats or, you know, not having a garden or not being able to be in the natural world. So it's almost as if nature's calling them out there and they're choosing to be in that outdoor environment. And interestingly, the staff are enjoying it too. It's almost as if intuitively you know that the outdoors is a better place to be. And I think that's kind of physical as well, because the children can move more, and a lot of them have had restrictive movement, and the adults. But it's almost as if the natural world has a healing property, a therapeutic property. And I'm almost thinking of the romantic notion of nature teaching and healing them in operation. But a lot of the activity, also interestingly, when parents are bringing them in the morning, a lot of the exchange happens in that outdoors. And so that outdoors has become very much more part of the daily life of these children, and really helping the children at a social and emotional to have that choice of being with nature in a kind of free flow way. And I'm going to illustrate this through Adele's story, which we're calling Gathering Blackberries. Now, interestingly, Adele had been with her grandmother in Greece during the COVID lockdown. I think they'd gone there and then not been able to get back. And she told her key worker that while she'd been out in Greece, she'd gone berry picking with her grandma. So they were back at nursery, she'd transitioned back in, but this was a nursery that had access to a forest school and, you know, regularly went into that forest school. And they noticed that Adele was particularly enthusiastic about being in at forest school, eagerly putting on her welly boots, her waterproofs. And when she went out into that environment, there was a climbing wall in their forest school, and immediately she spent some time climbing a wall, getting this high vantage point, coming down again, climbing the wall, coming down. That real physicality of climbing and movement was really important to her. And on one occasion, they noticed, while she was at the top of the wall, she'd noticed that there was a bramble in the wild area. And on that bramble, because it was September and blackberry time, she'd spotted some berries, some blackberries. And as soon as she saw them, she came down the wall and went running across to the bramble bush. And when she saw those heavy and juicy blackberries, you know, she made this wonderful, happy, giggling noise and started to pick and eat these blackberries in a very delighting way, with a sheer kind of pleasure and munching it. And I'm sure, you know, this link back to her grandma in Greece maybe, but not only that, she started to encourage the other children to come and join her in picking these blackberries and collecting them in containers to go and have for their snack. She seemed to be getting this fantastic deep delight with being out of doors and being in tune with nature and the autumnal gifts that were on offer at that particular time. So, you know, the children are telling us that outdoors is going to be really important for them and for all of us, actually, because the staff are appreciating it too, in getting through this time and keeping well while we're getting through this time. Fourth theme is play is centrally important in Froebel. It's centrally important for all of us who work with young children. But what the staff is showing is, even in these nursery settings where play's always been given prominence, they've been giving it special prominence at this time and seeing it as centrally important in supporting anxieties and their mental health. But they're noting that the nature of children's play has changed. It's more intense, more extended. They're doing it over days, the same play over days, quite repetitive. And interestingly, because they've been at home and not socially, they're saying they're playing in smaller groups and often in isolation themselves. So the nature of the play is really important and shifting in the way children are using their play. And the themes in their play are generally reflective. There's a lot of normal superhero play and, you know, physical play going on, but through that we are seeing the COVID experiences being demonstrated in what they're playing out. So there's mask wearing play, there's not touching games, distancing games, there's sanitation games, but there's also loss and bereavement play. In our nurseries, of course, some of the children have lost loved ones, lost family members, closer. So they have experienced bereavement and loss. And I'm going to illustrate this through a group story that I'm calling the death game. And I'm calling it that because that's what the children that are part of constructing this narrative called it. So a small group of children in one nursery, 2 or 3 children only, the staff had noted are repeatedly playing what the children are calling the death game. And it's quite, you know, it's quite shocking maybe for you to hear this, but what the children are doing is one of the children plays the role of the mum who starts to cough and then she falls down. The other children then carry out various caring rituals. So they bring blankets, pillows, drinks, and kind of do this nurturing, caring behaviour around the mother who's clearly role-playing being ill. And then at some point in the play, the mother dies, and the children kind of tend to the dying, and then the play ends, and then they go and do something else. And then this play is repeated again. Another interesting facet of this game is that when the practitioner comes near them playing this game, the children seem to stop the play immediately and run away and do something differently. And the staff are really reflecting on this. Do the children feel that the staff give the impression that this is a taboo subject, that it's something they shouldn't be playing, that it's awkward or odd or extreme in some way. So, you know, they're questioning, how have they given the children that impression, and should they get involved and enable them to see that it's okay? Or should they respect the children's right to play this out in privacy, with the people that they want to play it out? You know, important reflections that are going on with the staff about how to deal with this. Is it a private sharing experience? Should they respect it, or should they kind of bring it out into the open more? These are the illustrations of how deeply therapeutic and how sensitive you have to be as a practitioner in making those decisions about how you support what the children clearly are needing to play out in what they do. So, you know, really deep importance of play, but the changing nature of play during this time. Final one, and then we'll finish now for questions. I wanted to end with this one, the theme of what I'm calling children's COVID wisdom, and again linking it back to self-activity and reflection. Children are absorbing and thinking on a lot of information about COVID, and they clearly don't want to be kind of protected from it. They are asking and are curious, and they want to know and understand how the virus has arrived and what it is, and this authentic, real information and explanation about what's going on, and they're understanding what a germ is and how it flies through the air and how you connect it, why washing hands and sanitisation is important, how it contains it, why you have to keep a distance. Interestingly, in their play, we're seeing evidence of the politics of it. They talk about Boris's TV and role play it, or at Ern's in Australia, or Nicola Sturgeon. So that those political, those addresses where the families have clearly come together and listened to what's going on, and they've absorbed it, and they understand and show they deeply understand why you have to wear a mask, wash your hands, keep a distance, why parents are at home and not going to work. One other little bit of play we noticed was a child took the computer out of the computer area, took it into the home corner, and was role-playing parent working at home. So that was a lovely example of how they were making sense and understood what was going on there. So they really do show that they are understanding the seriousness of the situation, the consequences of breaking the rules, which maybe some adults, children often teach us, don't they? So I'm going to break with a couple of little snippets of Ava and Yusuf stories where they're showing a deep understanding of the coronavirus, the science of it, and the need for infection control. And here's Yusuf, who was doing some woodwork, and he was saying, you know, if it wasn't for coronavirus, I would be swimming after this. And the practitioner says, is there anything else he couldn't do? And he said gymnastics, because they've closed it, because if someone sneezed, other people might catch the virus. And then his friend Freddie has, and that's why we have to wash our hands a lot. And when you go to the park, you have to take wet wipes because of the coronavirus. And Yusuf says, we've got hand gel to get rid of the virus at home. And the practitioner says, do you think the coronavirus will go away? And Yusuf says, yeah, well, eventually. And Ava, she was spontaneously, the asked, how did the germs get to school? And the practitioner said, how did she think they get there? And Ava said, well, they flew through the air. So they do understand how infection happens, and quite mature in the way they understand that. So the message from that is that children understand more than we think and deal with more than we think, and they do want to not be talked down. They want to be included in that dialogue and understand how our society is dealing with that. So to finish, responding to these voices, we want to get these messages out there, and 5 take-homes from this, which might be also important for adults as well. They are saying the importance of regaining your daily life and routines is really, really important. And I think that's a challenge to policymakers and for us in practice. How much of their routine in the daily life can you keep going? Because this is so important to your mental health and keeping well. And a major part of that is reconnecting and being with their friends. Really, really important for, social isolation is not good for anybody, but it's particularly not good for these children. And the joy of connecting with their friends in whatever way they can. They need to be given the opportunity, not for oh, they've missed this, so we've got to intensify and sit them down and catch them up, but be given, truly be given, extended time to play and express their experiences and their emotional response to that in a deep and time-free way. Give them time for that. The real importance of nature and the natural world and being outdoors, really important message, and giving them honest and information and authentic information about what's going on and why, because they get that and they can deal with that in a real way. So to finish the power and challenge, you know, Froebel says the telling of stories refreshes the mind as a bath refreshes the body. I hope our telling of stories today has refreshed your mind and helped you think, and you know, giving exercise to the intellect and power, testing your judgments. And I think the challenge in these children narratives to all of us is to respond actively. What are we going to do with these voices? How are you going to use this information and the children you're working with and living with? Are you really listening well to what they're saying and responding to their needs? And echoing Froebel, I think this is going to be a test of our judgment and feelings too. Are you going to listen to that and give the children's desires and expressions of need room to be lived out in their daily life when they're at nursery and when they're at home? I think that's going to be a real test for us too. So thank you very much for listening to us. We're going to come back to the large group now, and we're open to answering your questions or responding to that.
Thank you both. Thank you. That was amazing. Thank you very much. We're just waiting for some questions to come in the chat at the moment. Can I ask one actually while we're waiting? I don't know whether this is the experience across settings so much, but I have a 3-year-old, and one of the things that I think has impacted on me and my son the most is the transition into the setting, because I can't go in the setting with him anymore. I have to pass him over at the door and he has to walk in himself. And before the pandemic, I was going into the setting, holding him, handing him over to somebody, having a little chat with them and then leaving him. Was there anything in the research that you've done where children are expressing their perspectives on those kind of changes, really?
Yeah, absolutely.
And the practitioners.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've got lots of narratives of practitioners as well. Interesting. They were worried about that, really worried about that. And there's a whole nother now, because we're talking to parents as well, and shared that with you today. Maybe we'll come back and do that another day. But you know, when they were coming back into school in this autumn term, and a lot of news, they were really worried about that. But they did the transitions outside. And in a distanced way. And very interestingly, they said that our practitioners are saying it went more smoothly this year than previous years, because the outdoors seemed to be calmer and there was space for it. But also the children, I keep saying the children have got a way of dealing with it, you know, and they said the children generally were really okay about it, and the you know, understanding of how that transition was going to. So they said next year they're going to keep the transition in the garden and open and do it like that. So the view was the children and the parents in many ways cope better through having to do that. But it wasn't a kind of abrupt, you've got to hand that child over. They used the outdoors as a transition space. And the other thing is the children, because they were outdoors, seemed calmer, so they weren't infecting each other with anxiety. You know, when you have new children coming in and one starts to cry and then that infects the other one, and that wasn't happening so much either. So there's some interesting narratives around that. Yeah,
I think there's a whole separate study been done on the parents and relationship with parents, which, as you're right, it's changed, you know, and we're going back to the 80s when parents were kept outside the school gates and not allowed in and all of that sort of stuff. And that's hugely important, those interactions that you have where you find out so much about each other. A colleague of ours has just done a paper on what he calls the schoolification of parents. And this is something else. You know, there's a sense in which we're schoolifying our children younger and younger and putting them into more and more formal settings and then implying a curriculum. So we've talked about the schoolification of very young children, but now we're talking about the schoolification of their parents as well. In areas where parents are getting huge amounts of, and I'm caricaturing here, but you know what I'm saying, of worksheets to plow through with their children and so on. So there is some of that. But on the other hand, one of the things that we're benefiting from is the social media. And if it's handled well and we develop some perhaps new ways of working with parents, I think that might be very positive. It doesn't replace having that face-to-face thing that you're talking about, but there are, I think, involving parents more in the learning as the primary and main educators and development of their children, you know, that could be positive, and we could certainly work on better things than are commonly offered to parents in terms of what you might do with your children at home. Is that too long a reply?
Yeah, that was really interesting. Thank you. Tracy, have we got any comments that... Oh, Tracy, you're on mute.
Classic.
That too.
We've got people talking about how they feel children have coped far better than sometimes the parents have.
I think that's true.
Yeah.
I think young children generally are very positive and are very optimistic about the world, you know, and they can lead us out of, I'm just thinking about my own grandchildren, they can lead you out of, you know, hard times.
I think as well, somebody was talking about practitioners' narratives on the experiences of parents during the lockdown in terms of giving space for free play at home, which was a really interesting comment. Sorry, that was sorry, I misread that slightly. Tiffany was just asking, did that come through in practitioners' narratives?
So what did Tiffany say?
Are you finding from practitioner narratives that some children are more engaged in their learning in settings due to having the space at home in lockdown?
Yeah, I mean we have got practitioner and parent narratives emerging that we're analysing, but certainly some of the broader stuff is it's very individual children's experience at home, you know, and it's really difficult to generalise. I mean, you know, if the parent's working, it's, you know,
have you got a garden around?
Yeah, have you got a garden? You know, have you got to? So it's really individual to generalise. Some children have had a whale of a time while they've been at home, and lots of kind of.
Have you got siblings or not?
You know, and others have had, and we mustn't underestimate. It's been very tough for some children and families as well. You know, what we definitely see is all of the children thrive better when they're in the setting with their friends for lots of reasons, even if they've had a relatively good time, you know, at home. Interestingly, during the lockdown period where the key worker children were in, and it was smaller groups or children, or they were kind of, those children seemed to thrive better too, because the staff had a more liberal regime, a freer regime, because it was different, and that seemed to enable those children to do well as well. But I also think it really depending on how well the practitioners were linking with the home. Some people had a lot of support from their nursery setting and a lot of guidance about how to support it, and others had none. So it's very, very varied, very, very varied, I think. But one of the things we're seeing is that the relationship between parents and practitioners has shifted during the pandemic. On both sides, I think there's a developing much greater appreciation of each other. You know, that parents are seeing what the practitioners did, you know, and practitioners are more respectful, interestingly, of how parents have struggled to support those children, and using different ways to connect, using technology, not for the children, but to support the parents.
I think there's a need and a developing need, and perhaps it's being neglected, to introduce, I don't know, you might call it the pedagogy of parenting, or the interrelational aspects of parenting and practitioners around pedagogy. I think there's an awful lot that can be developed in that, and I think it's something that's missed off an awful lot of initial teacher training colleges. How do we spend an enormous amount of time telling them that they've got to do this bit of the curriculum or that bit of the curriculum, but actually more time maybe ought to be spent on how can we work together with parents to develop the children, would be my view. So that might be something that we could think about.
Lisa, I think there was one from Catherine at the very beginning that I may have missed. That was quite.
It's a really interesting one. Have you any insights on how our children with communication and learning difficulties are expressing their inner world in this regard, and how they can be facilitated to tell their story and work through their experiences?
In the study, we've got children with SEND. I mean, one is a case study. This one severely disabled little girl who had learned about hand washing, and was in all her play situations doing this repeated hand washing play. But that was, you know, she was struggling to do that because it was very difficult for her to manipulate that. So it's expressing that that's really quite important to her. So you know, we haven't separated those stories out yet, but we will look at those. But in a way, they're expressing them in their own way, in a very similar way to all the others. You know, similar themes, similar silences, similar, you know, things they do want to talk about, and how skilled some of those practitioners are at tuning into to children who find it more difficult to express, but they're doing it. You know, we're learning a lot about pedagogic strategies as well as what the children are saying. So I think we'll have more to say on that, certainly.
I do think it's about the quality of the pedagogy, obviously, you know, and how you create forums for children to be able to express, and how you observe those, the spaces you give them. And just little things that it may be that children do communicate even when they can't talk, you know. And you've only got to look at neonates who are well able to express whether they like something or not. But young children do a lot of emotional, what the psychologists call emotional referencing, you know, where they're doing something and then they just turn and check at you to see this is okay, is this okay, that can, it's picking up all of those kind of clues. And I don't know that we give enough time to that kind of development in our initial teacher training. And
we're very interested in non-verbal communication. They're telling their narratives in lots of different ways and tuning into you know, the many ways children are communicating and giving us information.
And they're searching your face all the time, or even your body language to find out. You know, those awful studies they do where they have a neonate and the mother ignores them. I don't know if you've seen videos of that. The child gets depressed. Children are looking at you all the time to see if this is behaviour that I'm doing, or this activity is being sensitive to those sorts of things.
That's why I think the death game is quite interesting, where they're choosing to be away from adults. And you know, there's some very fascinating things coming out of this. I picked up Debbie Nye's comment there about interpretation. You know, we have to be honest, we are interpreting, you know, we're looking at it, but we're never looking at one child's incident, one event in isolation. We're doing a narrative sequence of a child over a period of time, and then looking at when they come back to it. And all the time we're having reflective dialogues around what we're seeing with the practitioners, understanding there are many ways of interpreting and making sense of this. So that praxeological thing about that critical reflection and dialogic way of interpretation and analysing what's going on is really strong, and really struggling to make sense of what the children are communicating with us in a respectful way, because it is our interpretation.
And the other thing, Debbie, I take your point, you know, and you're creating something out that's in your head, not in theirs. And part of that might be that you go poking into things that children don't really want to talk about, you know, and they've found some coping mechanism that works perfectly okay for us. We have talked about that, and it is about giving the children space and then observing what they do. So it's about creating, if you like, the opportunities, the affordances in an area, rather than deliberately trying to elicit things. And you can do that through watching their play. Good question, Debbie.
I think that we've almost run out of time. It's not that I think there are some questions in the actual chat still, And people, please do feel free to actually add some more later. And if it's okay with you, Chris and Tony, if there are some, we might forward them to you to perhaps, and I can respond.
There's a blog and a website on the Froebel page.
If you go to the Froebel Trust site, you'll see an interim report. We're just publishing a paper in the journal. And somebody asked about the schoolification. There's a paper on that by João Formancino in the ECRJ. Doing a special issue on COVID. So a lot of the wider research will be there. So João Formancino's paper on the schoolification of parents is there. Our report is on, interim report is on the Froebel Trust, and we'll have a paper in this special issue. But you know, CREC has a site and is developed. There's a site for all this there, so you can get more information. I'm quite happy for these slides to be passed around as well.
I'll do that. Yeah. Yeah. I think that Helen had some on her slides as well. So if I get those emailed out, if you don't mind, then that will give people the links to that information, and that would be really good.
Right.
And just to say to everybody that we do appreciate your professionalism. I said it right at the very beginning. Yeah. And this is your Saturday afternoon, folks. Get out there and enjoy it, you know.
Time to play.
Yeah. And thanks for taking part. And as I say, your professionalism is commendable. And we're doing this for young children and families, not for ourselves. Yeah.
Thank you both, and thank you, Helen, as well, for all of you doing the keynotes today. Can I just say that before you go and enjoy the afternoon, if you could just pop a comment in the chat just to say a little bit, just a small comment about your experience of this conference, maybe the take-home messages for you.